Okay, hi everyone. The topic I'd like to cover this in this video is one of the other macro social processes. Specifically, I want to talk about collective behavior. So, collective behavior covers a wide range of social behaviors, including things like riots and panics, fads and trends and rumors. We're going to just look at riots and panics as kind of two exemplars of collective behavior. Um, if you um, if you're interested, obviously, in other examples, obviously that's something that you can kind of pursue on your own. Or, I know that we cover those things, say for example, in our social psychology class. Since this is an intro class, you're just kind of getting a little bit of a taste, and I think riots and panics are relatively frequent events. So understanding them, I think, is a really good use of this time and this particular video. Um, Collective behavior fits under a larger umbrella that we call collective action. So, collective action is a broader term, and it describes, in essence, actions that people engage in as a group, and action that people formulate as a response to problematic conditions, often in response to or in opposition to existing social norms. So the umbrella term is this thing we call collective action. Underneath collective action, we have collective behavior, which we're going to talk about in this video, and we have social movements, which we're going to talk about next time. So collective behavior is distinguished from from social movements in that it is spontaneous. So collective behavior, in other words, it's not planned, whereas social movements are planned and organized. They aren't always necessarily successful, but they are always sort of intentional. Now, both have structure, and both end up following a series of socially established rules, and operate according to sociological concepts um, um, ideas. But if you're wondering what the main difference is between collective behavior on one hand and social movements on the other, it's that the former is spontaneous and the latter is planned and organized. All right, but in this video, we're going to talk about collective behavior, so let's talk about collective behavior. Collective behavior is defined as relatively spontaneous social action, often in contrast to social norms, undertaken by a large number of people who have gathered to work out a joint response to an ambiguous situation. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, so let's kind of just take that apart a little bit. Obviously, the spontaneity is very much there in the definition, so that's really easy. I think when you're looking for what is the correct definition of collective behavior, you want to be looking for the word spontaneous. That is what distinguishes it, as I said, from social movements. Taken out by a large number of people, that's identical. Social movements and collective behavior are not particularly distinguished in terms of size. The standing in contrast to social norms, also something that is common to both social movements and to collective behavior. Where I think you also get a point of distinction, aside from, of course, the spontaneity, is the ambiguity of the situation. So what happens in collective behavior is people come together to try to work out how they are going to respond to a situation that is not clearly defined in the sense of, say, definition of the situation or an agreed upon intersubjective understanding of a kind of socially constructed reality. The interpretation of the moment is in flux. It's contested. It's not fully settled. And in that space, and I'll talk about why in just a moment. But in that space, people will do what they can to sort of generate an answer to a fundamental question that we're asking all the time, even though we're not necessarily conscious of asking it, which is this: what's going on here? So I'm going to dive a little bit into some of the social psychology of this, just so you have a sense of what's driving this process, and then we'll kind of step back and go out into the larger universe of collective behavior and sort of talk about theories. The thing that you need to understand about human behavior, and it is a theme that has been picked up and been very explicitly woven into almost all sociological analysis as you've taken this course and sort of explored these topics over the semester, is that all social behavior, or the vast majority of social behavior, is socially determined. Right? So most of the things we do and say reflect existing social expectations, and we learn these social expectations through a process of social encounters and experiences that we call socialization, right? So we're born into the world not really knowing anything about how we are supposed to conduct ourselves or how the world around us is organized. But as we have experiences with that external world, one of the things that's happening is we're learning to identify people in terms of the social positions they occupy, and understanding that a lot of their behavior, the majority of their behavior, in fact, flows from the expectations that are associated with those positions, and not the people themselves. And I think most people miss that, because when we look at human behavior as non-sociologists, we tend to try to analyze it as originating in the thing that we're watching, which is an individual person. And so, not surprisingly, in our culture, most of the explanations for human behavior that are used by sort of the lay people out there, the sort of non-sociological thinking majority of the population, tend to be psychological explanations. And the problem is, of course, that an individual person is very often a poor representative of a group of people, right? And this is why in sociology our interest is in social facts, not in the things that are true of individual people, because an individual person may or may not be particularly representative of the larger group. But if we can understand something about the larger group, then we've arrived at a sociological truth or a sociological fact, even if we understand that it isn't going to apply to all the people in that society. So I've been, the class has been, the design of sociology has been, for the past part of the semester that you've had up to this point, been trying to kind of drive that home, right? That most of the behavior that we observe in our everyday interactions is a reflection of socialization and social expectations, not anything that originates in the individual organisms that make up society. As such, it sort of points us to think about the nature of the kind of organism that would need that kind of structure and patterning. And this does kind of get us to the level of psychology. And even sociobiology or biological inclinations. And one of the things, and again, some of this is highly speculative and theoretical, but one of the things that seems to be true of human organisms is that we are what we call pattern-seeking creatures. So much so that there's a term for our tendency to see or recognize patterns in behavior and data that is in fact not patterned data at all, right? So the term for this, by the way, if you've not been exposed to these ideas before, this is called apophenia. And we talked about this a little bit in chapter 2 when we were talking about culture, but I'm going to bring that back a little bit for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about with regard to collective behavior. Apophenia is a tendency to see patterns in otherwise random data. And this seems to be, again, a kind of a precondition or a hardwiring sort of aspect of how human consciousness works. There are lots of different examples of what this looks like. Maybe one of the most famous examples is something called pareidolia, which is where you have a tendency to see faces in non-human objects. So you look at the moon and the craters and the lava flows and the dust beds and the light playing off of the surface of the moon, for some people can suggest a human face. Or you might look at the front of an automobile and instead of seeing two headlights and a grill, you see two eyes and a mouth. This is how Pixar has been able to sort of anthropomorphize automobiles, and we get the Cars franchise. So the idea that we're imposing order, we're imposing some sort of meaning onto otherwise meaningless data. That's apophenia, and again, specifically when we're talking about people recognizing faces, we're talking about pareidolia. And what this suggests is that we, as thinking organisms, are constantly looking for patterns, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Patterns sort of describe the way in which our society is kind of ordered, and our society being ordered in such a way gives us a really, really helpful set of clues and guidelines for how it is we're supposed to behave in interactions. So when we walk into a room like a classroom, and we see classmates and we see the teacher, and there's the whiteboard and the podium, and we know that we are supposed to be in this room at this time on this day because it's your sociology class. The answers to those questions, those understandings that we have of the moment and of the context and of the others in that set of interactions, gives us some very, very helpful information about how it is that we should be conducting ourselves, what it is that we're supposed to do and say, because we are able to sort of locate ourselves within that broader social context and see the expectations and understand the expectations that others have of us, which makes our behavior very predictable for them, and the expectations we have of them, which makes their behavior predictable to us. And because we can predict their behavior and they can predict our behavior, it becomes possible for us to align our behaviors together into what we call joint action or social action. So spontaneous social action is a really kind of interesting phenomenon, right? Because in the situations that might lead to collective behavior, like riots and panics, there isn't really a script, for lack of a better word, for how it is we're supposed to behave. And that reality, that truth, is going to be really, really essential to understanding sort of the current state of theory when it comes to collective behavior, which I will get to in just a moment. But I do want to very quickly point out that attempts to answer this question, right? Why do crowds, or why do groups of people behave, and sometimes in very, very different ways than the individual people who make up that group, right? There is something about crowds, there is something about groups of people that seem to be special, or in some ways unique, compared to the people who make up those groups. Now, these theories and social psychology and sociology have been speculating about this very phenomenon for well over 100 years. One of the very first studies came out in 1895. A French social psychologist named Gustave Le Bon wrote a book called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Now, popular here today, in the 21st century means, sort of lots of people like it. But back then, popular meant population, or the collective, or the shared. So it was the people, right? It meant the mind of the people is the way to sort of think about how Le Bon is using that word popular back in the 1890s. So the question that drove him to speculate and to theorize about this was, why do crowds seem to behave differently than the people who make up those crowds? And for Le Bon, the answer was that when people got together in sufficient numbers, this thing emerges called the group mind. The group mind is the consciousness, in essence, that guides the actions and behaviors of the people in the crowd. It's not the same thing as the total of all the minds that exist in the individual members of the group. It is actually a mind of its own. It's distinct from the other minds, and it's working on its own level. Now, this is a little nuts, right? And even back in the 1890s, Le Bon admits he has no idea how this happens. He even speculates at one point that it might be something like magnetism, right? But something happens when people come together, their minds kind of get replaced by a collective mind or a group mind that then directs behavior and then directs action. And obviously, you might have some questions, and other people have had questions about this for a very long time. Like, for example, if the mind is a phenomena of the brain, then if we have a group mind, the next question is, where's the group brain? How does that group mind connect, right? And again, he even admits he has no idea how that works. Why does the crowd seem to select or land on one particular pattern of behavior as opposed to another? What accounts for that? Some people in the crowd might presumably want to do this, but other people in the crowd might want to do this other thing over here, and maybe the crowd as a whole ends up doing this or something else altogether, and there's no explanation for why that might be. But it's kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the amount of time historically that people have spent trying to figure this out is impressive. We've been at this for quite a long time. Number two, I think even though we can sort of look at Le Bon's theory and sort of chuckle and say, okay, that guy really was kind of off base in a lot of ways, listen to how people talk about crowds these days, right? We just, recently had a series of riots and violent demonstrations in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, back in 2020, and when people would be interviewed on camera about looting or violent demonstrations or unanticipated or what seems to be inexplicable crowd behavior, people will say things like, it was as if the crowd had a mind of its own, right? So, you hear rhetorically a lot of what sort of still sounds like people struggling to answer this question in the same way that Le Bon sort of tried to answer it. Now, the good news is, in the social and behavioral sciences, we sort of walked past that. We're not speculating. At least most serious scholars are not speculating about the existence and operation of a group mind. Instead, over the last 100+ years, we've gone through a series or an iteration of theoretical explanations that have gotten increasingly more, I think, increasingly more accurate. The term we would use is valid, right? So the two things, kind of the holy grail of scientific research, is validity and reliability, right? Validity: do we get measurements of the thing that we're trying to measure? How true is what we've discovered? Reliability is how reliably can we replicate the results of an experiment or an observation or a test of some sort, with the idea that if you have a lot of reliability, you're probably on to something, whereas if you get one result once but then you're never able to replicate that result, that was probably one of those off sort of results that seemed to suggest an answer but has not actually been able to be reproduced. So we're looking for validity and reliability, and over the period of time since Le Bon's study up until today, we've seen a lot of different theories. We've seen contagion theory, and Freud's had some theories about sort of the way in which anonymity in crowds allow people to sort of allow repressed impulses and desires to kind of come out. Like, everybody, or almost everybody, it seems, has speculated at one point in time why crowds seem to be different than the individuals who make up those crowds. The state of the art, I think, and by no means am I sort of an authority on this, but I can tell you that the theory that tends to hold up, the theory that makes really reliable predictions that are then supported by observation or measurement or testing, is a theory that emerges in the 1970s with these two researchers, Turner and Killian, called emergent norm theory. So emergent norm theory takes some of the information that we know about the nature of a crowd and uses that to sort of undermine some of the previous assumptions that theories of collective behavior had presented. So at one point, for example, some people had speculated that a crowd of people gathered for a demonstration or a protest, for example, might share a number of inclinations or tendencies or dispositions. There's some homogeneity to a crowd. But in fact, as social science and behavioral science got better at sort of measuring these events and specifically talking to the people who are involved in them, one of the things that they realized is that crowds are actually quite heterogeneous. They're really diverse. There's all kinds of variability in terms of attitudes, previous experiences, understandings of the moment or the issue, right? So when they got in there and they started doing that sort of research, they realized, hey, these crowds are not made up of like-minded people. So that can't really be the explanation for why crowds seem to behave in a unified fashion. There has to be something else. So emergent norm theory says that crowds are these diverse and heterogeneous collections of people, but who are all looking for an answer to that question: what's going on here? How am I supposed to behave? Right? The circumstances are ambiguous, right? We don't know how to behave in a crowd because that's not something we're socialized to, right? You know how to behave in a classroom. You know how to behave at your place of employment. You know how to behave, around the family dinner table. You know how to behave when you're out with your friends because your social experiences and the socialization process has given you an answer to the question, what's going on here and how am I supposed to behave, right? There's no socialization experience that tells us how to behave when we're in a crowd, but we are desperate to know how we're supposed to behave. That's the pressure. That's the dissonance that sort of drives people in these ambiguous situations a little bit crazy. And emergent norm theory says crazy is, I'm being very flippant. That's not actually a term that you should rely on. But it nags at us, right? We need to know how we're supposed to behave, because if I can't predict how other people are going to act, and if they can't predict how I'm going to act, because we don't have a lot of shared understanding here, then our ability to create some sort of unified or joint action is going to kind of fall apart. So what happens is, according to emergent norm theory, in this kind of ambiguous situation, the crowd develops a group norm. And the group norm then establishes a kind of framework for the interaction and actions that are going to unfold and gives the crowd a sense of uniformity. In other words, they create a norm, or a norm emerges in the context of the gathering, right? And the norm that emerges collectively and jointly understood becomes the thing that guides the behavior of people in this event. For as long as the event occurs. And then when the event resolves or ends and you go home, the old existing social norms that you would typically rely on are sort of reasserted and present, and that's what you kind of lean back on. So I'm going to make that really concrete by putting it into the context of something like a riot. Riots are a kind of collective behavior in which a large number of people have assembled. The purpose is to protest a grievance or something that people are angry about. And out of that situation, a violent protest emerges, right? So that's where we get riots. Riots aren't planned. Riots aren't organized. They happen, and we can look at the circumstances and conditions that are likely to lead to riots and understand that there are certain interventions that can be done that would make riots less likely to occur, right? So it's this notion of an emergent norm theory framework doesn't just allow us to describe, it allows us to explain. And in explaining, we can also see places where the behavior of a large group of people could either be nudged toward or directed away from violent behavior that we typically associate with a riot. So imagine a scenario. There's a large gathering of people in Daley Plaza in downtown Chicago. I don't know, they're there to protest inequality in law enforcement. The policing in poor communities and neighborhoods of color is, disproportionate to the rate of crime. White communities are being under policed, right? The sort of the injustice of the criminal justice system. Let's say that that's the thing that people are protesting. Not everybody in that crowd is there for that purpose, right? Most of them are. Maybe even a sizable majority of them are. But some people were just walking by and they were curious and they walked over and they said, "What's going on here?" Or maybe one of the people at this demonstration or protest works in an office with somebody else who has some sort of romantic attraction to them, and this person doesn't really care about criminal justice, but they really like this other person, so this other person's going down to this demonstration in Daley Plaza, so I'll go with them, and maybe I can, take them out for coffee afterwards, right? So the point here is that the people who have assembled for this event in Daley Plaza aren't all there with the same understandings. They're not all there sharing a unified sense of injustice and outrage at the way in which law enforcement is working in our communities. They're there for different reasons. They have different agendas. They have different notions of what's proper and improper. But all of them are wondering how it is they're supposed to behave in this situation that is not familiar to them. So let's say that the crowd has now decided, the leaders of the crowd, people standing at the front on the stage with the bullhorn or whatever, they're like, okay, we're going to march from Daley Plaza to the criminal courts building in the South Loop. So everybody form up, you get into the street, we're going to start walking down the street. Somewhere along the way, somebody throws a rock through a store window. Now that is definitely non-normative behavior, right? In any other situation, right, it's pretty objectively the case that that's a violation of social norms. But we're in this weird moment where we're not sure what the norms are. We think that the norm is don't do that, but we look to the crowd to see how key figures within the crowd are going to respond to that, right? So if the leaders of the march turn around and they grab that person and they take them over to the side of the road and say, "Hey, officer, it was this person. This is the person who threw the rock." The message that goes out to everybody else is, "Hey, throwing rocks is not going to be tolerated here." But if the reaction of the crowd to that exact same behavior is, "Yeah," right? Everyone throws up their arms and they cheer boisterously. The message that you get is, "Hey, this is apparently acceptable behavior to these people." Now that, I want to note, does not obligate you to start throwing rocks. But from the reaction of the crowd, you can make some inferences. For example, the next time somebody throws a rock, if you grab that person and try to take them over to law enforcement, you can infer, and I think with good reason, that people in the crowd might actually turn on you, right? Because they've demonstrated a tolerance for that kind of behavior. Your intolerance of it will put you at odds with what you see to be the group norm. And that still may be okay. You may still decide to turn them over to the cops, but you do so knowing that that's going to result in you kind of being marginalized or pushed out of this group, because the emergent norm, the norm that has emerged in this moment, is that we are going to engage in vandalism and property destruction. That is something that the crowd has indicated that it will tolerate. And so even though not everyone in the crowd is doing that, we could say that it is a social fact that this is a violent demonstration, even if not everybody in the demonstration is engaging in acts of violence, because that norm has emerged. And here's how you know that it is a temporary emergent norm and not a new norm, because when the riot finally breaks up, when law enforcement has gotten everybody out of the center of downtown Chicago, or people have just sort of lost interest and they've kind of wandered away, whatever it is, when you're walking home later after all of those events transpired, you're not still throwing rocks through shop windows, right? You understand that while that was a norm in that moment, it's not a new norm. It was a temporary contingent norm specific to that particular collective behavior, that particular moment in place and time. So emergent norm theory really fills in a lot of the blanks that other previous theories of collective behavior sort of either had to assume or sort of scratch their heads and say, well, we don't really know that yet. There's a lot of rigor to this theory, And it gives us, in addition to a really nice explanatory framework for things like riots and panics, it allows us to sort of break down the structure and the phases of these collective behaviors as well. So, for example, in a riot, the riots, every single one of them will go through stages of development. There's what's called a precipitating event, and then there's a confrontation phase and a carnival phase. And I know that sounds really fun, but think of carnival in the sense of anything goes, not, ooh, I'm going to get some cotton candy and I'm going to win a little plush doll. It's a different kind of carnival. So the carnival phase is followed then by the siege phase, in which everything is sort of reasserted. All the previously existing social order is kind of reestablished. So when you read Ellsworth and you're looking at the events of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, the confrontation on the steps of the Tulsa courthouse, in which somebody fired a shot, and that signaled to everybody else who were gathered there, the whites who were trying to lynch Dick Rowland and the blacks who were trying to prevent that lynching from occurring. All of those people suddenly understood that it's the norm that will be in place now is that we can use violent, deadly force to try to advance what we want to get out of this particular context. The confrontation phase happens a little bit later in the evening in Tulsa, when the whites invade the north side of the city. That's sort of when the next stage of the riot occurs. We call it a race massacre, but it has the same framework and structure as a riot. But it was pretty one-sided. At the end of the day, about 300 plus black Tulsans were killed. Significant numbers, thousands of them had fled the city. Those that were left by the next day were mostly locked up or under guard. So, it's if you think about it as a riot, you sort of miss the ethnic and racial imbalance of what actually transpired. But it is a riot in the collective behavior sense of the word. So you can look at the events of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and you can see precipitating event. You can see confrontation phase. You can see the carnival phase, when the looting and the fire and the mayhem is occurring on the north side of the city. And then, of course, the next morning, when the National Guard arrives and they start to reimpose law and order, you see the event entering the siege phase, and then it kind of comes to an end. 2 days, right? The 30th of 31st of May and the 1st of June in 1921. But for that roughly 12 to 14 hour period, the entire city was kind of in the grips of this newly emerging set of behaviors that people were engaging in the day before and the day after they hadn't, right? So you see the way that the norm emerges in that moment. Panics are much the same, right? Panics are also structured. Panics are also sort of, you can see some of the principles of emergent norm theory at work there, although the way that emergent norm theory maps onto panics is a little bit different, because the nature of a panic is, of course, that people are in the grips of a highly charged emotional response. So there's a lot less kind of social construction happening in those moments, and much more just reactive behavior. But there are still some elements that we can take from emergent norm theory and see a crowd sort of trying to work out a response in the face of some degree of ambiguity in a response to a threat. And so let me talk a little bit about panics. Panics, as I said, are events in which people, again, a crowd of people, not individuals as individuals, but a crowd of people, are responding to an immediate threat with really, really highly charged emotional behavior. And the problem with really highly charged emotional behavior is that it interferes with our ability to reason. And in the grips of a panic, people will do things that actually increase the harm, both the harm to themselves, or the risk of harm, I should say, the risk of harm to themselves and the risk of harm to others. So the danger actually goes up, right? So you've got a threat. The response to the threat actually serves to increase the danger rather than reduce it. So, number of really, really good examples of this throughout U.S. history. Very recently, in our own neck of the woods in downtown Chicago. When I say recently, I mean within the last couple decades. So, in 2003, I think. Um, I think it's 2002 or 2003. I'm sorry, I'm not recalling right off the top of my head. At the E2 nightclub in downtown Chicago, there was it was 2003. Um, the um, the E2 nightclub was a second floor um, dance club above a restaurant called Eponymous, which starts with an E. So E on the second floor, E2, right? So the E2 nightclub is on the second floor of this restaurant. Um, During the night, you've got hundreds and hundreds of people in this dance club, dancing, drinking, socializing, having a very very wonderful evening out on the town. Um, on the dance floor, a fight breaks out, and in response, security, right, the bouncers and the other security personnel in the club respond by using pepper spray, which means that the people like right there, have a face full of pepper spray, and they start to fall back. They want to escape the threat of this cloud of noxious chemicals. The people who are a little further away may not have as much information about what's happening, but they see people running away from the center of a room in which there's this kind of amorphous cloud of something that is apparently frightening them. They start to run. People even further out on the edges of the dance floor and amongst the tables see people running from the center of the room and screaming, and they're not going to stop and ask questions. They're going to try to get to the exits as well. So what happens is there's a very interesting comparison, right? Because the people who ran to the back of the club went out onto a fire escape and down into the alley behind the building. The people who ran toward the front exit had to go down a long flight of stairs before they got to a little vestibule that would then allow them to step out onto, it was either Wabash or Michigan Avenue, I'm not sure. I think it's Wabash. The problem was that the door at the bottom of the stairwell opened in as opposed to out, which is a violation of fire code for reasons that you'll see in a moment. But what happened was, because they couldn't open the door because of all the people behind them, um, um, they were crushed to death. They experienced what's called compressional asphyxiation, which is basically where the air gets squeezed out of you and you suffocate, because all of these people on the stairwell behind them are pushing forward, trying to get away from whatever's behind them. But all they know is that the crowd isn't moving forward, right? They know there's a threat behind them, but they are sort of wondering, like, what's going on? Why aren't we moving? And they start surging forward. And you can see, when you break this down, I think 21 people were killed and dozens more injured, as a result of this, right? This panic. And you can see, if you sort of break this apart, you can see all the places in which the structural and behavioral conditions in that moment led to this particular set of outcomes. First is partial entrapment, right? If you are not enclosed or entrapped in some way, then the likelihood of a panic is almost nothing, right? If you're in the middle of a big wide open field and there's a threat in that field somewhere, you can run literally in any direction and get away from it. So you will run, you'll flee a threat because that's what you're supposed to do to stay safe, but you won't panic, right? Remember, panicking is different than just being afraid and running. So you can be partially entrapped outside. So imagine being in a very narrow canyon, right? There's a very, very steep walls on either side of you, and there's a wall of water coming down the canyon toward you. You can't really climb out. You probably won't be able to outrun the water. And your response to that is to sort of go into this highly charged sort of emotional state in which you won't think particularly clearly. If anyone's ever had lifeguard training, they always tell you to approach a drowning victim from behind, because if they see you coming, then they're going to reach out and they're going to try to stand on you. They will push you underwater because all they care about is getting their head above water and not drowning. That actually is going to make it very dangerous for somebody trying to rescue somebody who's drowning, which is why they're very, very careful to tell you that if you're approaching from the front, be careful not to let a drowning person grab you, because they will in all likelihood, increase the risk of harm to you as they try to help themselves, because they're not thinking. The drowning person isn't thinking about this response, this rescue, in any kind of rational sense. So partial entrapment is the first, what we call necessary condition. None of these things are sufficient, right? None of these things by themselves is enough, but any one of them has to be present, or every one of them, I should say, has to be present in order for a panic to occur. If you take any one of these out of the equation, then you don't get panics. So partial entrapment, a perceived threat. I say perceived because the threat doesn't have to be real. It just has to be something that people understand is something that endangers them. And even the danger itself doesn't need to be particularly mortal or serious. There was a concert in Ohio back in the 70s in which a number of people were crushed to death because the crowd waiting outside the music venue heard what they thought was the band playing. It was actually just roadies tuning up the instruments. But they thought the concert had started, but the doors weren't yet open, so they pushed forward trying to get into the arena, and the people at the front got crushed, right? So you could say, well, it's just a concert. What was the threat? Well, the threat was, I'm not going to get a good seat. I'm going to miss this concert that I really want to see. So when I say, threat, it's a pretty liberal understanding of what we mean by threat. But that's the second element, right? So the first is partial entrapment. The second factor that shapes a panic is the perceived threat. The third is a breakdown in escape routes. Now, this one's really interesting. For the people running down the stairwell at the E2 nightclub trying to go out the front entrance, they know there's a door down there. They know that there's a way out onto the street and away from whatever danger exists inside the club. But they don't know why the crowd's not moving, right? The perception is that the escape route is not available, or it's only possibly going to be available, which increases the desire to get to the front, to be the one who can get out. When people are in a situation where there are multiple escape routes and everyone understands that the escape routes will remain open and available, there's no panic. Interestingly enough, when there are no escape routes, when there is no way to get away from the threat, there's also no panic, right? People are still going to want to try to get away from the threat, but they're not going to panic because they understand, that they're not going to be able to get out, right? So like when crash investigators started listening to the flight data recorders of planes that had crashed into mountains and oceans and wheat fields in the middle of Kansas or whatever, they were struck by the fact that pilots didn't seem to be all that panicked, even as their plane was rapidly approaching, the point of impact. A lot of regret, anger, apologies being made to other members of the cabin crew, but nobody panicked, and everybody sort of took a while to ponder this, but they came to the realization that the pilots know that there's no way to get out. So even if you could somehow open the window to the cockpit, you're still thousands of feet in the air without a parachute. You're going to plummet to your death. So no panic because there's no escape route. No panic if there are lots of escape routes and it is understood that the escape routes will remain available. Only a panic when there are escape routes, but people are unsure about whether or not they'll remain available. This is why we do things like fire drills, right? There are lots of easy ways to get out of a building in response to a fire or some other internal threat. But the more you practice, the less likely you are to freak out, because you know where all the exits are, you know that you can get to any one of those exits and it'll be available to you. And so you don't, find yourself climbing over your coworkers or your classmates or whatever to sort of find a way to get out. The panic does not actually ensue. And then the last shaping factor for panics is there's a breakdown in what we call front to rear communication. The people at the E2 nightclub who were down in the vestibule, right, looking out onto Wabash Avenue through this glass door, knew that if everybody on the stairwell would take 5 steps back, right, just take 5 steps back, we can open this door, everybody will get out, everybody will be safe. Obviously, if that had been able to be communicated from the front to the back, then, 20 plus lives would have been saved. But when you are being crushed, right, when all the air in your lungs is being squeezed out by the weight of hundreds of people behind you pushing down, and they're all screaming, right? It's impossible to get that information from the front to the back. So whenever people who have the greatest amount of information about what's going on with the escape routes, when they are not able to communicate that information to other people, then the panic is sustained, and injuries and death can be the result. So again, right? Structure. There's structure in all of this. There's a even in things that look completely random and just sort of emotionally reactive sort of phenomena, have a kind of structure to them. The behaviors in those contexts are driven by the nature of the context. So that takes us to the end of what I want to say about collective behavior. Next time, we are going to talk about social movements. Social movements a little bit different. Who am I kidding? They're very different, but still, I think, equally interesting, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. In the meantime, of course, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And in the meantime, I'll say take care, and I'll see you next time.